Hello to all of our listeners, and welcome back to The Parent Solution, your one-stop shop for all things educational. I'm your host, Kimberly, and today's episode is a guest episode. And if I'm being honest, it's one that I'm actually really excited about because our guest today is Steve Hargadon, a gentleman who I might classify as revolutionary in the world of education. Steve, it's really good to have you here.
I'm so glad to be here. Although I find that funny, given the context of what I think we're going to end up talking about, I think you're going to end up classifying me as a non-revolutionary.
Oh,
It's part of the story, right? And the story is having watched education revolution and reform for the last 20 years and having drawn some conclusions about it.
okay. So expand a little bit. What do you mean by that?
Okay, so if it's okay, I'll just give you a very quick overview of my background and then
Of
I'll give
course,
some context.
of course. Yes, please.
So I, s- I started doing an interview series on open source software in education. I looked
Mm-hmm.
at the way in which open source software was developed, the kind of collaborative nature of it, the way in which people apprenticed into the open source world. And I interviewed sort of the great names in the open source software arena, thinking that that was going to become the model for rethinking education. That interview series morphed into what became the Future of Education.com interview series
Mm-hmm.
and ultimately had over 400 interviews, during the course of which I went through sort of all the stages of thinking about education and change and some successive waves of um, different reform movements that took place during that time.
Mm-hmm.
So that was super interesting to see. Then I started something called Classroom 2.0, which was a modern social network for educators. And this was in the MySpace era. So it was actually new. At the time, people thought social networking was going to be a terrible influence on education. MySpace had a very mixed reputation. There were reports of people committing suicide because of MySpace. There was a concern about having I don't know if you remember, but there was a concern that people could post comments on your page that you were not in control of. So you were not actually in control of the
Yeah,
material on your
I
page.
remember.
Oh yeah, it's a big deal. And so I did Classroom 2.0, but it actually became very successful at the time,
Mm-hmm.
not by numbers that we would consider hugely successful now, but the education community was networked by about 100 educational bloggers, and people would go to their blogs and then comment on their posts. And
Mm-hmm.
so when Classroom 2.0 came out, all of a sudden, instantly there was this community able to actually talk to each other across school walls and boundaries and geographic boundaries. And it was so exciting. I mean, people thought it was just an amazing thing. And I remember we reached 400 members and people could not believe it. They were just ecstatic. It
Mm-hmm.
ultimately ended up growing to about 80,000 members. I sold it. The company that bought it didn't want to keep paying the payments for it. It didn't work out for them. And so I bought it back. And at the same time, I took over Library 2.0, which was a similar effort started by a guy named Bill Drew in the library world. And he was going to close it down. It had not been as successful, but I said, hey, I'd like to keep it open because I care about libraries and I think it's a good project. That's actually become a larger market for me in terms of my professional work than Classroom 2.0. But and interesting piece of the story. And then I also started a global education conference. So we used the technologies that were just sort of starting to arrive of large scale online communicating,
Mm-hmm.
and held the first worldwide global education conference. We had 400 presentations, 450 presentations, 50 keynote speakers. It was this incredible event. And again, it was this moment in time where people felt like things had changed forever. People stayed up 48 hours, 72 hours straight. They couldn't believe they were talking to educators around the world. So this all puts things, I think, into a little bit of context because it's a reminder that these sort of seminal moments come and go.
Mm-hmm.
And what we think is going to radically change things, why didn't it actually really change things? Why are things largely the same in the education world, and where are they not the same, and why? And so that's why I kind of hesitate about being sort of the learning revolutionary or the learning revolution, although that's the domain name I use primarily now for projects. Because in a lot of ways, I've come to conclude that education reform is a little bit like tilting at windmills, right? There's a wave of us who get excited. This technology is going to radically alter uh, education, and then
Mm-hmm.
the technology comes, and then nothing really changes. The classroom doesn't really change. The relationship between teachers and students doesn't change. And so, why is that? And we can talk about that in this time, because I think that's why I'm here. But I think the lessons of that are, and then where we go with those lessons. So, could I start with some caveats?
For
Maybe
sure.
they're
I
they're
think
sort
that
of
would be a good idea.
so these would be things I wrote down about why change is difficult. And the first is that I think largely as human beings, we have a hard time thinking beyond the next immediate level to us, right? So
Of course.
some of the ideas of the homeschool market, which have been around for decades now, right, are several levels above the current thinking of the average classroom. And so in a
Mm-hmm.
lot of ways, we're just not good at jumping up several levels to understanding, right? We are good at following. In fact, we like to follow. And so moving up several levels is kind of to a systemic level of thinking, and that's hard for us. So
Right.
lots of times we can get excited about something. We say, oh, hey, we could radically alter the experience of students. And people are like, yeah, but what about college? And what about the SAT test? What about getting kids? And what I've come to conclude is, for most people, you can't present them an idea that's 3 or 4 levels above where they're thinking. So there's
Mm-hmm.
an old marketing adage: sell people what they want, give them what they need. And I think the reason that that is so profoundly valuable is that people have a want that's right above where they are, and they don't necessarily want to think 4 or 5 levels above that. And I remember for years the homeschool community would try and create justifications for why homeschooling was so much better than traditional schooling. And the immediate comparisons were test scores and college admissions, and then that kind of played okay, right? There was a conversation there, but the moment you get to, well, they live a very different life than someone who goes through traditional schooling. They often get into the arts, or they're in the trades, and they're very happy, and they're minimalist, or all these are sort of other things that are a little bit beyond our normal capacity to think to when we live
Mm-hmm.
in the system that we do, right? Where things are the way they are. So that would be sort of my first, sort of comment about we're thinking about education reform, is that it's difficult to think above the current level, and that most of us have trouble doing that, and that we like to follow. The other piece of this is that we live in narrative stories. I don't think we evolved for truth. I think we evolved for success, for survival. So in terms of sort of evolutionary theory, right, the tribe or the group didn't have double-blind studies. They didn't have the scientific method. They had stories that were cohesive, that kept them together. And so the reality is that most of our lives we live in simplistic stories that often aren't actually the truth, but they're comfortable for us, right? And so I read a book that I didn't fully agree with, but found the idea really compelling, which is the book's called The Elephant in the Brain. And the idea is that all of our large scale institutions don't actually do what they say they do, right? So we have stories about like the banking industry, that it's to help us be good savers and take care of our money. But that's not actually what banks do. Banks make a profit, and often at the expense of their depositors. And so the story, though, we need the story. It's the simple story. It's very hard for us
Mm-hmm.
to think beyond simple stories, right? There are very few of us who can actually think in terms of large systemic complexity. So we like the story, and in a lot of ways, each area of our life is within a story, and the story doesn't have to be true for it to be helpful to us. So from banking to pharmaceutical to governance to economics to warfare, There are these stories. And the interesting thing is that the internet is breaking a lot of those stories. It's taken some time, but over the course of the evolution of the internet and the sort of massive amounts of information we have and the ability to tell counter stories, we're discovering that we don't often have the right story for what's going on, but we don't have a good replacement story. And so that can be really painful. And we can want to just go back to the story we're in. And I think that relates to schooling a lot, right? Most of us recognize this is not actually how students learn best.
Hmm.
This is not the best system for personal happiness, but we don't have an easy next story. And so we just go along.
I find that something that I see a lot in parents that I speak to is, well, yeah, the schooling system doesn't work, but what else am I supposed to do? Right? They know that it's an
Yeah.
ineffective system, but what else am I supposed to do? As with, like you pointed out, with banks and pharmaceutical and governance, we know that it doesn't work. What else are we supposed to do? What are the options are
And we
there?
don't want to live, we don't want to live in constant confusion. We don't want to be,
Hmm.
stressed out every day. And so, you were introduced to me through Chris Loper and Greg Smith, and
Hmm.
they're doing a Parenting for Academic Success summer course through my Learning Revolution platform. And that course is very much in the story of school is where you learn how to learn. And it's hard, and kids have to go through difficulties, and they learn how to learn. And that's not actually my story, right? So for me, it's not about parenting for academic success. It's about parenting for life success. But the parents really want, okay, how do I help my kid get better grades? How do I help them succeed in the existing system? I could go on forever about, what actual success and happiness are and how you would parent for kids who would grow up that way. But that's a that's a deeper, harder story to get to if you're in the throes of life, right? You get up in the morning, you go to
Yeah.
work, you're making your payments, you got all these things going on. That may just be a bridge too far for a lot of people because it's, I need the thing that will solve the problem of today. My child isn't doing well in
Hmm.
school, so how do I help them do well in school? Okay, can I give a final kind of big
Yeah,
picture thing?
please.
So uh, I'll give two quickly. So one is that I think history is cyclical. A lot of people think that history is progressive. Like we've learned so much and we're at this pinnacle of human development and we understand things we didn't understand before. And there is truth to the degree that we have information we didn't have before, but we also have a lot of information that turns out not to be replicable and isn't necessarily true. And we don't realize the degree to which these things have cycled through before. It's really interesting to go back and read the literature of the 1920s because there was a lot of personal development and self-help literature. This is very similar to what we say today. And so we like to think, oh, we're sort of more evolved than we've ever been, but we're still subject to the same large-scale historical, I believe, the large-scale historical cycles. And those cycles tend to follow generational patterns, and we make the same mistakes over and over and over again as
Hmm.
human beings. And civilizations show that. And so we're not immune to those same cycles of history. And I don't think that sort of super optimistic view that we now know more and we could build perfect schools and we could do all this kind of stuff. I don't actually think that's realistic, in part because we've just talked about the fact that people have personal motivations, but also because I'm not actually sure that we do know that much more. We may have some more scientific knowledge, but in terms of our human ability to live and to live happily, it may not be the case. And that leads me to sort of the final point, which is I think our lives are way out of balance. I think we live in a world that is so profoundly dependent on us buying into the story of consuming and producing and all of these things. And it's not a healthy story. And it's a story that serves a lot of interests well. We buy things, we keep energy going in the free marketplace, we've got all this stuff going on. But people are very unhealthy and unhappy. And it's really hard to get off that treadmill. And school's a part of that treadmill. School facilitates us getting into that system and it facilitates us participating in all those things. And it's really hard to stop and say, hey, I'm going to live intentionally on a farm where we grow our own food and whatever else, right? Because those are really big changes to a system and we tend to blame ourselves. We don't realize the degree to which the system is set up to make us feel like we're deficient and self-sabotaging, but in large part, is so unhealthy, and all of the pharmaceutical drugs and the things that people do to get to to feel some sense of purpose and happiness are very sort of surface level when you think about it. So we'll stop there, and you can kind of prod me as we go forward.
I love the fact that we're on the same wavelength, be it in a bit of a different aspect, or coming from different perspectives, I might say. I feel like I have a bit of a different perspective on the same sort of issue, but in a very similar manner to what I think you're saying. Before we talked, I never really thought about the idea of like, that's a good marketing slogan, right? Like, don't sell. It's like sell people what they want and give them what they need, because half the time people don't actually even know what they want, right? And I really like how you focus in on that idea within schools. And I mean, I have said this for quite some time, that schools are not designed to make great thinkers. They're designed to make good citizens. They are designed to get you used to working a 9 to 5, right? Why do you think school is the time frames that it is, right? You can say, oh, it's because parents have to work and blah blah blah, but parents work all kinds of jobs and they work at all hours. The 9 to 5 is not something that is typically that is necessarily part of every family's life anymore. And I think that the school system as a whole really makes that obvious in terms of this is what's expected of you when you come to be an adult. And I see it all the time with a lot of kids that I work with, where they're in school and they come out of school, and the last thing that they want to do when they're 17 or 18 years old and they graduate is keep learning. The last thing that they want to do is go out on their own and do something on their own, because they're just tired. They're just done, right? They're now this, I don't want to say a slave, but they're now this like obedient slave to the wage system, or to the greater powers that be, whatever you want to insert there. A lot of them don't have the willpower or the creativity to be able to do something on their own. And that does have a lot to do with, family and upbringing and community and culture. But school, I think, plays a large role in that, because besides the parents and the home, school is the place where the children between ages 4 to 18 spend the majority of their life, right?
But that's not the story we tell of school,
No,
right?
of course
And
not.
I
Of
think
course
you and I
not.
would
Because if it was
you and
framed
I would
like that, we would say no, not at all, right?
yeah. So you and I would agree, and at the same time, that's a hard pill to swallow for a lot of people. Meaning the
Mm-hmm.
story we've been told about school, the story that we want to believe is that school helps us become better learners and helps every student reach their potential, right? But that's not actually what schools do. And there's a reason why um, modern public schooling is pervasive worldwide now. And it's
Mm-hmm.
because it's a really good idea for large scale governance, right? I mean, it just works really well. You get a large group of people who believe the same thing and have been inculcated into what Plato calls the noble lie. We can talk
Mm-hmm.
about that a little. But it is this story that facilitates so much else in our society. And to think beyond that is hard, right? I mean, if you said those words to somebody who's in a regular traditional school system, they're going to be like, oh, you're crazy. That's not actually what's going on here.
Mm-hmm.
There aren't people out there, using this to control us.
Yeah, the common term nowadays is conspiracy theorist. That's a common term
Yeah,
that I hear, right? Which
yeah,
is anything that's in opposition to what is portrayed to be the mainstream system of whatever that happens to be, right? In this
yeah.
particular case, we're talking about school. You said that you wanted to talk about the noble lie. Tell me a little bit about that. That's a theory from Plato.
Well, so in Plato's Republic, he talks about the role of schools. And he
Mm-hmm.
says that we tell a noble lie, that what schools do is that they convince kids that they're gold, silver, brass, or bronze, and that it's a lie, but it's a noble lie. We tell it for a noble purpose, which is society can't function unless people accept the roles that are sort of assigned to them, or that they swim in their lane. And so this is not a new idea,
Mm-hmm.
right? but it's not the story we tell of schools. So if you say that again, it's hard for people to feel good about it. This is why I use something I call generative questions, right? Because it's hard to confront something that's very different than what we think, and especially if it's several levels above. So I
Right.
will often ask questions, hopefully to allow people to go through their own thought process. And you and I have talked about this. Like one question I ask is, what percentage of high school students do you think graduate as competent adults? And when
Yes.
I ask that question, people smile or they give a little laugh, and then they'll often give different answers, but the answers are always low. I will tell you that the most common answer is 5%. So if you define competent adult as someone who can live on their own, start a family, and live on their own, have a good job, and start a family, you realize we can differ on our actual estimates of where that is, but that's not really what happens for most kids coming out of school. In fact, sort of intriguingly, when we stop and ask that question, we really start to say, well, so what are we doing? Like, what would we, if people don't come out of school as sort of confident and competent adults, what's actually going on? And so then that's why I feel like the question is valuable, because I'm not trying to give the answer. I'd like someone to actually have a chance to sort of think about it. Like one question I'll ask students is, if you could reinvent school, what would you do?
Mm.
And it's a really fun question because they will spend hours telling you how school could be different. And I don't have to say anything for them to kind of conclude, oh, this is very different. One I use with adults is, what was your best learning experience in your life?
Hmm.
And what were the conditions that led to it? And this is a fun one to do with teachers because they will describe a very vivid remembrance of a great learning experience. Then they'll describe the conditions that led to that experience. And then I'll say, how many of those conditions are present in your classroom or in your school? And you begin to realize that's not actually what we're not building those conditions necessarily for great learning experiences. We're building conditions that create a sense of conformity and compliance and getting things done that you're asked to do and obeying, right? But the direct confrontation with that is hard.
Right. Because it's so far, and I know we talked about this before, because it's so far out of what I think you referred to as a cultural schema, because it's not in our cultural memory or our cultural history, um, for us to really remember, because it's like everyone in this generation has been in public school, right? And there has always been, like you pointed out, um, the alternative idea, or the alternative narrative of homeschooling, right? Or unschooling. But then you have those confrontations that pop up like, oh, what about college? Or homeschooling kids are backwards, which is completely not true. I teach a lot of homeschooled children, and they're, in a lot of ways, they are a lot more advanced than they should be, for their age, academically, but also just in life, because they're more prepared for life in what I would say is the real world, or as a successful adult.
Yeah, although intriguingly, they may not be well prepared to work in a large corporation.
Yes.
I think what you're describing is they have good thinking skills and they're
Hmm.
independent and they're self-motivating, but those aren't necessarily skills that lead to a job in the banking industry in New York coming out of college, right?
Hmm.
Can I tell you some other things that I think sort of intriguingly are what schools actually do?
Of course, I would love to hear your opinion.
So one of the things that kind of prompted me on part of this journey was that I would ask people about their school experiences, and I was shocked that it would often lead to people starting to cry. It was a surprise to me how deep the wounds were from their school experience. And say I wasn't a very good student, I was never very good at math, and I came to the conclusion that one of the things that schools do best, not through intention of the people who work in the schools, but through the intention of the sort of the system, is that they teach most kids that they're not good learners. So the great majority of kids come out of school believing that they're not good learners. Okay, so that's sort of the noble lie, right? I'm brass, I'm not gold. I'm not in that top percentage. So I talked about this at a conference that was held at Google's headquarters. And I said, I'm concerned that schools teach most kids that they're not good learners. the best thing schools do best is to teach most kids they're not good learners, and that there's this sort of top 10% who are actually good learners when they come out of school. And these students came up to me afterwards and they said, we're interns at Google. We're clearly in that top 10%, but we didn't think we were good learners. We were good at the game of school. And
Mm,
I realized, for me at least, that was a profound kind of realization that school is a game. It's a game that you learn to play, and it's the same, it's the game of college and it's the game of corporate life, right? It's understanding what the rules are. And a lot of kids don't even know that's what's actually going on, right? So the top students know this isn't about becoming a good learner. It's my grade point average, and I'm going to get recommendations for college, and these are the things I'm doing to put on my college applications. And they're in a very collegial relationship often with each other as they're vying for the top positions within their class in what is a game.
mm-hmm.
And there are a lot of kids who have no idea that it's a game, and they're thinking, I'm not a good learner. They don't even know the rules of the game. I did a survey of my teacher audience a couple of years ago, and I said, what are the rules of the game of school? And I actually built a whole workshop on this because the teachers told me exactly what the students need to do in order to be successful at the game of school. And it's really good advice within the context of school being a game, kind of learning that. And
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I'll tell that to people, and it's very liberating. Like, it's very liberating to certain kinds of students to realize that it is a game and it's not a judgment on their capacity as a learner, but they just need to learn the rules and kind of
Yeah.
figure it out.
Yeah.
So I think school, number one, is very wounding to a lot of people. Number two, it's a game. Um, I do think that schools exist, uh, maybe don't exist for, but have the result of sorting students in a way
Mm-hmm.
that's very helpful to society. And it is a part of the reason that modern public schooling is so well, it's why it's mandatory. Why modern public schooling is mandatory in most countries. And I also think that it matches the start of modern public schooling, kind of matches with psychological understandings that developed in the late 1800s and early 1900s around uh, controlling people and understanding how people work. And then you get sort of in the early 19 teens propaganda, and you get sort of large scale movements that depend more on psychology than and behavioral kind of um, actions than kind of logical thinking. So we've become very accustomed to the idea that we get people to do things through a form of manipulation
Mm-hmm.
uh, that kind of coincides with the growth of modern public schooling. And so I think schools are a part of that system.
I would agree. I think that schools are, yeah, like I mean I've said that you expressed it very eloquently, but I've said that for like a while. Like schools are not designed to make great thinkers. They're designed to make good citizens, right? So when it comes to creating people that are, or rather forming, I won't say creating, rather forming and influencing people to go down a certain pathway in life, like you talked about streaming or sorting society. And I think that's a really good way to put it. There's sorting the societal the people in society and kind of the streams in which they should go. So I think that's very valuable. I know when we were talking before, it kind of felt like, um, what is it that we can do about this? I mean, you've offered a little bit of a solution in terms of, like introduce like small things, right? Don't give people too much, or that you're gonna scare them away in essence, right? Because they just can't handle that sort of mentality. But what is it that you like in your professional and your sort of personal um, life? What is it that you would suggest that we as a society or perhaps as individuals can do to maybe not solve the problem right away, because I feel like that would be huge,
Mhm.
but maybe to mitigate this issue a little bit.
So I would love to do that if we could take a short side trip right before it.
Mm-hmm.
So uh, part of what you said that's so interesting to me is that when we describe the function of schools, it feels like we're presuming that the people who work in schools have that as their goal or
Hmm.
um, their purpose. And I don't think that's true, right? I don't think most teachers would say my job is to indoctrinate students.
No,
They
I
would
don't
say
think
my
so
job
either.
is to help students become good learners,
Yeah.
right? So the moment we say that, my concern is that it confronts at a level which is not actually true those
Hmm.
individuals who are working in schools. And it's a complex idea, right? That we can have a system that tells a story that's different than what it actually does, right? So if I say school, like I think you've used the phrase indoctrination station, but if schools are an indoctrination station,
Yes.
that's going to be hard for people to hear because they're like, well, wait a minute, that's not what I'm doing, and that's not what my kids are doing,
Hmm.
because that's not the story, and it's not what their intended purpose is. So that's why and this is like a short little segue. That's why I feel like school reform efforts often um, hit a brick wall because I think it's important for us to recognize people have much better motivations who work in schools than uh, that conclusion would indicate, right? We
Right.
can describe what schools do, but I don't think that's the motivation of the individuals in schools. So I think it's really
Hmm.
important to understand we have better, more human and higher aspirations than that, right? So here's where I've watched people go through the school reform movements and schools have not changed. I'm thinking, okay, so how do we look at schooling in terms of change? And you and I can save and decide if we want to have time for, but like I have a personal set of values around what why education is valuable and how we treat students and children and all of these sorts of things, right? That you and I would probably agree on. Whether or not we actually identify those at this point, if we make an assumption that we feel like things should change, right? Then, and we can come back to those particular pieces if you want, then I do have some ideas about how we might look for models for change. And my biggest model is the changes that we've seen in the food world in the last 40 years.
Hmm.
So when I grew up in Palo Alto, California, at the time there was one health food store in the whole area, and it was kind of a rinky-dink hippie operation, right? But it wasn't Whole Foods, right? There was a food co-op that developed at some point along the way, but alternative food was not the thing. It was a small story of some committed people, but it wasn't a bigger story. And it's interesting to think about what's happened since then because clearly clean food, different ways of thinking about food are much more prominent now than they were before. And there's a good alternative story about food. There's still industrialized manufactured food. And we could say the same things about food that we're saying about school, right? That
Hmm.
food doesn't
For
actually help
sure.
kids, that most food get healthy and grow strong. There are scientists who work very hard to make sure that the balance of fat, salt, and sugar are just perfect to get you to want to keep eating. And their goal is profitability. And so we can say that they're not dissimilar circumstances. But if you look at the food arena, it's interesting the way in which the alternate stories about food have grown. First there were some really good books, and there were some prominent people like John Robbins, who left his family fortune from Baskin Robbins and wrote a book. And so there were books, and then there were movies. And you and I could probably both name movies that we watched, about food, and lots of people watched them, and they started thinking differently about food. And
Hmm.
then you get the growth of sort of large scale chains, right? So uh, natural grocers, Whole Foods, and then you get Amazon buying Whole Foods, and you realize, okay, now we're at a whole different story level, right?
Hmm.
Because you have a large corporation owning the whole food chain, and they've reneged on some of their promises about particular aspects of food quality and uh, transparency. But then you have places like Walmart that now sell organic foods and have to do a good job because they're a lawsuit target. So
Hmm.
if Walmart says food is organic, it actually has to be organic or has to match the organic standards. So we now live in a world in which there are food options, I'm not talking about restaurants. The fact that you can go into a city and there can be a huge variety of restaurants is another great kind of parallel,
Mm-hmm.
right, to learning, because food and learning. But just the idea that in terms of the grocery experience and the buying of regular food, we now have options, and there's a good alternative story. And so I think it's healthy to think about learning in that way, right? Rather than, okay, we're going to reform the system. You're never going to reform the food system. You can't even imagine,
Right.
how are you going to top down restructure what everybody does and all the incentives? And it just doesn't make any sense. So
Mm-hmm.
in terms of food, we think, okay, it's good that there are people who can create alternatives and variety, and it's it's a more realistic, less ambitious goal, but it's super valuable to have small scale to then large scale operations that provide an alternative in food. And I think that's a really healthy way to think about learning, right? Not we're going to change the system, because I think that's unrealistic, but we're going to work hard at creating good alternatives.
I like that. I think the idea of starting small, and going to something bigger or larger, obviously that would take time. But I think creating that healthy alternative and the knowledge around that healthy alternative, right? Like I mentioned earlier, I have parents that say, well, like what else am I going to do? Um, and like I'm full of suggestions and solutions and things that we can do to problem solve. But people are not used to thinking that way, right? It seems like it's such a big problem. Speaking specifically with education, it seems like it's such a big problem to solve that you almost don't know where to start. And if you do start, you don't quite know where you're going, or how you're going to do that. So I think providing, like you were saying, providing some sort of like a healthy alternative narrative to be able to buy into that story, if we want to put it that way, is I think a good sort of solution. And I admire the work that you're doing with Learning Revolution and with trying to spread awareness of those things, because I think that's really important.
Yeah, I think micro schools are a interesting movement for that very reason, which
Mm-hmm.
is they're going to be different. People are going to run them very differently. They're going to have a different set of values. Chartered schools have a lot of people who really don't like chartered schools, but in a lot of ways, chartered schools have done the same thing. They've created different models for learning that give people choice.
Mm-hmm.
Homeschooling, right? If the current numbers are actually real, there are a lot of people trying out homeschooling, and I think there's a temptation to want to create a one size fits all solution, right? We need to do this one thing for everybody. But I actually think that the food uh, analogy provides us with this other kind of nice parallel, which is you want variety and you want things to be
Mm-hmm.
different and you want there to be experimentation. And the pushback would be, well, wait a minute, you can't experiment with children, right? You have to make sure it's good. Well, what percentage of kids are not well served by the current system? And if you actually have variety and you have experimentation, is that actually as bad a thing as you think it is? Or is it likely to produce more positive experience for students than they currently have, which
Mm-hmm.
I tend to believe. I mean, it is hard, but it's hard to think, okay, so if you don't have this standardized structured system, are there kids who will not be well served or are going to have difficulties? Yes, and you want to look for solutions for that and be as helpful as you can. But I also think that the one size fits all system probably produces more bad experiences than the more sort of open marketplace.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a really good way of putting it, because I very much agree that, I mean, there are some students who do very well in the public school system. They may be, like the top 10% or whatever, but they're very good at playing the school game, right? I am of the mindset that with education, like with actual education, it should be a learning experience. I say all the time, like learning is a journey. It's not a destination. You can't just like finish learning. You don't ever get to finish learning. And I think that's um, part of the mainstream sort of idea of like, okay, I'm done school now, right? I'm done learning. No, not particularly. I think allowing children to explore, like you said, to explore different alternatives whether it be like homeschooling or unschooling, or some sort of micro school or pod or whatever it might be, but exploring those different educational alternatives, I don't think is as harmful as a lot of people think it is. Yes, you want to quote unquote do education right, but are you really doing anything wrong if you're just presenting them with other learning opportunities? I would say no.
No, I agree. And I think what you're doing, sort of as a learning coach, is a really great model, right? The idea that there would be people who would help people through different processes, whether they're homeschooling or in public school or their ADHD or whatever their
Mm-hmm.
circumstances, that you would that there is an ecosystem of people who can help parents and students magnify their learning to the best degree possible. Learning is a very natural human experience in the same way that eating is, right? And so co-opting learning into a system that it only comes from structured government supported schools is um, is in itself, I think, sort of indicative of what we've talked about, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's a form of control,
Yes.
and again, the lessons of history are that people like power and control. It's
Mm-hmm.
you know it's a natural part of the human process. You get large scale cultures and you get people who have power and control, and you were joking about conspiracy theories, but anybody who's studied history or been in business knows people get together to do things in secret in order to accomplish goals,
Yes.
and that's conspiracy reality, right? And it would be silly to
Yes.
think otherwise. But
Yes.
if if we're convinced that those things don't exist, then we don't question and we kind of go along. Ultimately, you can make the argument to some pretty bad consequences.
Yeah, I saw a joke the other day that what's the difference between a conspiracy theorist and reality? And I was like, oh, that's a good question. Like, then I scrolled a little further and about 6 to 12 months. Like, really, if you think about
Yeah.
it, a quote unquote conspiracy theory is
Hmm.
only a conspiracy theory until it becomes true. Because then, like, now it's fact, right? And like you said, if you look at history, I like how you said that people, like small groups of people, get together to do things in secret to accomplish goals. And because as humans, we want power and control, that's kind of where it goes.
Yeah, and that's a fun other conversation, but there's plenty of historical precedent for things that we were told were one way that actually turned out to be another way.
Mm-hmm.
And so that doesn't go away,
No.
right? It's not like that's gone. And part of the value of a vibrant society that gets to debate things is understanding that you're putting pressure on people to not do that,
Mm-hmm.
right? To that's why you have Freedom of Information Acts and why
Mm-hmm.
you get information, because you're trying to make sure that there isn't a temptation to do something that's harmful
Mm-hmm.
or is being misrepresented in a large way. So I love the micro school movement. I love the learning coach movement. I'm working on a project right now. I feel like libraries are really underutilized. You would have thought with the advent of the internet that the information professionals would have become like gold, right? But intriguingly, I read somewhere recently that only 3% of school libraries have an actual devoted librarian. And so school libraries and public libraries, my experience as librarians is that they don't feel like they're really an active part of student learning processes. And if you do that exercise of what were the conditions that led to your best learning experiences, then it's not hard to see that librarians can often play a really great role, right? So they're an adult who cares about learning, who doesn't have an expectation of performance, right? So the idea, librarians can be this sort of thoughtful, caring adult who plays a role in helping students actually explore interests and find things that they care about. So the project I'm working on is called Student Success Centers. Libraries, in a lot of ways, have sort of lost um, their cultural story,
Mm-hmm.
as to what their purpose and meaning is, and in a lot of ways have sought for things to do to stay relevant.
Mm-hmm.
But the idea behind student success centers is that libraries can set up very easily student success centers that don't have to be super sophisticated to actually make a difference in the lives of students. And many of them do that already, right? They have
Mm-hmm.
computers and they have caring adults and they have programs. Um, and then I think my other solution is, uh, do you know the Solomon Asch experiments?
It sounds
So
familiar.
he brought people together, and like he had a big display of lines of different lengths, and then he would have like 19 compatriots, people who were in on the experiment, and he would say which of these two lines are of equal length. And so the first 19 people would all give the wrong answer. And then the final person, who was actually the unknowing, the unwitting participant, they
Hmm.
watched to see how many of them would give the same answer as the first 19, and how many of them would actually say what they were seeing,
Right.
right? So, um, you know, interestingly enough, the great majority of people went along with the previous respondents. It was very hard. The social pressure to say something different than other people have said is very hard, to the degree that some of those who actually were interviewed afterwards would say, I actually thought the lines, I actually thought what people were saying was true. My brain actually saw what they had told me to see.
Mm.
There were a percentage who said, no, I knew the lines, that these two lines were the actual ones that were of the same length, but I just couldn't bring myself to say it in front of the group. I was like 70% would go along with the group.
Right.
When they introduced one person out of the 19 who also told the truth, the percentage of people who said that things were different than they actually were went down to like 30%. And the conclusion was that just saying things thoughtfully and carefully that are true makes a difference, right? That if you're willing to stand up, you don't have to be the massive reformer, you know, a lot of things go on, but as long as you are willing to try and figure out what's actually going on and to tell the truth, you make a difference to the people around you.
Hmm.
And so I think that's a valuable thing to think about, which is, I don't have to convince somebody that school's a bad thing. I mean, there's a lot of good that takes place at schools, and I can ask some questions that help to raise some interesting issues about school, and I can talk about school as a game and help people to see it differently. And I can also say that sometimes I think people actually leave school feeling that they're not good learners and that wounds them. And I think sometimes by telling the truth in that way, we encourage other people to see things clearly. And so I think it's important not to minimize that particular aspect of what's going on. You know, that part of what we do is to try and talk about things in an honest way, so
Hmm.
that it gives permission to other people to actually see things a little bit differently than they have.
Yeah, and to kind of introduce that other idea into the picture, so to speak. Because I mean, and this goes back to, like, I mean, call it history or call it sociology, whatever you want, but you catch more flies with honey than you do with vinegar. So I mean, that is true, right? In the sense that more people, if we apply that concept to people, more people are going to be attracted by seeing the good things in a certain lifestyle or choices or whatever you want to put in
Yeah.
there. They're going to see more good in that than if you were to talk about all the bad things that the other thing that they're doing that they should not be doing is is causing them, right? Like I feel like that's probably that's a much more effective way to approach the problem. So I admire what you're doing. That's awesome. I'll have to hear about your project and how that turns out. That's exciting.
Another thing we can do is, like, if you're having conversations about schooling, you know, a great question to ask is, what character traits do you want your kids to have in 20 years?
Hmm.
Right? And what are the conditions that would lead to those character traits? Because it shifts the ground for what you're talking about, right?
Hmm.
Because
Changes the
parents want their
conversation.
kids to be, yeah, they want them to be independent and self-confident and capable, the like. And so you say, okay, so how do you get to that place?
Hmm.
Right? And that can kind of open the door to those questions. One of the things that again, given my perspective on the cycles of history and the difficulty of um, maintaining progress, is I call it the grandparent test. It's like, okay, have you talked enough to your kids about what happens in parenting and family life to give them the tools to be good parents themselves? right? And you could say the same thing for students. Have you talked enough about the learning experience for them to be helpful to someone else in terms of their own learning, right?
Mm-hmm.
And there's a good word for this. It's called generativity, but it's this idea that we not only do the thing, but we do it in such a way as to help have it regenerate. And I think that's, sort of, if we have generational aspirations, it would be that we leave the next generation more capable of doing things than we have been, or at least capable of doing good things. And that requires kind of being open and having good conversations and talking about what's the process of learning, and how do you help people become learners, and how do you help people become adults, and how do you help people have agency, and how do you help people accomplish valuable things in life. So the more conversations that we have in that regard, I think the better.
I would agree. I would agree. Thank you so much, Steve, for being here. I really appreciate your insights and your time and all of your energy that you've put into this. Thank you.
Oh, you're most welcome.
That is all for this episode of The Parents Solution. If you have any comments or questions either about this issue or others that have come up for you, you can always find me on social media. It's Star Students on Facebook and LinkedIn, or starstudents.learning on Instagram. You can also always reach out through email, which is all over social media channels as well. Thank you, as always, so much for listening, and I'll be back next week.